Hello, my name is Helena Gindi. I'm the Public Program Director here at YIVO. Welcome. We are delighted you are here for tonight's annual Naomi Prawer Kadar Memorial Lecture, Creating Identity, Yiddish Across a Spectrum of Jewish Communities Today, with Paul Glasser, Isabelle Barrière, Sarah Benor, and Ross Perlin. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank the Kadar family for making this evening possible. YIVO's Executive Director, Jonathan Brent, could not be here tonight, unfortunately. He's in Vilnius on behalf of YIVO, and before I read greetings on his behalf, I'd like to call attention to two inserts in your program. Firstly, we have information about a few upcoming educational opportunities here at YIVO, including Yiddish language classes, our winter program in Ashkenazi civilization, and 2 spring classes. We're also thrilled to announce the inauguration of the Jacob Kronhill Visiting Scholar. The first Jacob Kronhill Scholar will be Professor Steven Zipperstein of Stanford University, who will be offering an intensive graduate-level seminar open to everyone on Jews and the Russian Revolution in April 2014. If you're interested in finding out more about any of these classes, please see Jennifer Young, YIVO's Director of Education. The second insert is our YIVO survey about public programs. This fall, we're beginning a dialogue with our audiences to learn more about you and the kinds of programs you're most interested in. We'd love to hear from you. Please fill out the survey and drop it off at the YIVO table in the Great Hall after tonight's discussion. And now, I'd like to read just a few words of welcome from our director, Jonathan Brent. I wish I were in New York this evening to welcome all of you, the family of Naomi Kadar, and our excellent speakers, to the annual Naomi Prawer Kadar Memorial Lecture. As these words are read, I am in Vilnius with my colleagues from the archives and library to advance our project to create the first complete library of Yiddish literature in the world. We hope to accomplish this by digitizing all the Yiddish language material in Vilnius, material that represents the legacy of the YIVO Institute of Vilna before World War II, and uniting these materials digitally to our collection in New York. In doing so, we will also be able to recreate virtually the pre-war Strashun Library, one of YIVO's most magnificent collections of rare Hebrew and Yiddish books. This is only one way in which Yiddish continues to flourish at YIVO. Our summer program, adult language classes, and numerous lectures, conferences, films, and seminars such as the one this evening continue to bear witness to our commitment to keep alive this precious element of our heritage. I am most grateful to the Naomi Foundation and the Kadar family for making this program possible. Thanks also goes to Helena Gindi, YIVO's Public Program Director, Paul Glasser, former Dean of the Max Weinreich Center, and Jennifer Young, YIVO's Education Director, who were responsible for putting this panel together, Alex Brandwine, who designed the program and publicity materials, and Suzanne Leon, Director of Development. And now it's with great pleasure that I introduce Paul Glasser, our moderator for this evening, to say a few words about Naomi Prawer Kadar and introduce the panel. Thank you.
I'd like to second everything that Helena said, to welcome Naomi Kadar's family and to thank the Naomi Foundation for its sponsorship. There's a beautiful sketch about Naomi in the program that I'm sure you've seen. I just want to add a few words of my own. I've been trying to remember when we first met. I don't remember. It seems like in this very small world of Yiddish studies that we always knew each other. Unfortunately, we never got to know each other all that well. And I missed my chance, and I regret it very, very much. We ran into each other constantly while Naomi was here at YIVO doing research. She lectured once or twice in our Yiddish seminar series about her research. She was a great scholar. She was a lovely person. We also worked together on the Yiddish summer program. And I always like to point out, and I don't think she ever told me this, I think this is probably Mordechai Schechter, who liked to out people, that her Yiddish name was Nacha Kreindl. I think he told me that, and when I mentioned it to her, she said, "Let's keep it a secret." So Schechter would out people who didn't immediately introduce themselves with their Yiddish names. But the interesting about hearing Nacha Kreindl is that that immediately gives away where the family was from. In the sketch, it says that she was born into a Yiddish-speaking family, but anybody named Nache has got to be from somewhere between, let's say, Warsaw and Krakow, and that's where they were from, right? Sosnovitz, yeah. It just has a lot of meaning for me. And I'm very sorry she can't be here tonight. I know she would have loved this program. In fact, if she were here tonight, she'd probably be on the panel. So, yeah, it's like we should have a chair for Elia Novi and for Naomi. A few words about the panel tonight. First of all, I just want to say to the audience, I know you all worked very hard out there at the reception, so the panel is your reward for all that hard work. Now, let me introduce the speakers. Isabelle Barrière is on the faculty of Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center at CUNY. She's director of Research for Policy and Education at Yeled Ve'Yalda Early Childhood Center, and she is studying language transmission among others, among Hasidim in Brooklyn. And we're going to hear today about Yiddish being spoken among Hasidim and how it is transmitted from parents to children, particularly in view of the fact that the Hasidim in Brooklyn and elsewhere are most of the people who actually speak Yiddish with their children today. Ross Perlin is the assistant director of the Endangered Language Alliance. He has studied Yiddish, among other places, here at YIVO and at the Vilnius program. And he reported for the Vorwärts from China. Was it 2 years ago? And he's the only person I know of offhand who knows both Yiddish and Chinese. He will be speaking about Yiddish in contemporary culture. Sarah Bunin Benor is associate professor of contemporary Jewish studies at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles. And she is the author most recently of Becoming Frum, How Newcomers Learn the Language and Culture of Orthodox Judaism, which is available in ebook form, by the way, for those of you who don't believe in carrying around paper anymore, like me. And she will be talking about Yiddish among various shades of orthodoxy. So we are attempting in this panel to cover Yiddish use and Yiddish attitudes to Yiddish in the whole spectrum of Jews, as much as we can in a short panel like this one. Just a few questions I'd like to throw out for people to think about before we start, because I think I'm already used up all my time. I get emails quite frequently, how many people speak Yiddish today? And my answer is, do you mean people who know Yiddish or people who actually bother to speak it? As far as we can tell, there are quite a few people who know Yiddish but don't bother to speak it anymore, either people who are Holocaust survivors, and of course there are fewer of those every day, unfortunately, or their children who may have spoken Yiddish with their parents but don't make a habit of it. And then there are the people who actually make a habit of it, and we're going to be talking more about the people who actually use Yiddish in their daily lives. But it's interesting to think that these two numbers could be so different. Which brings up the question of Yiddish as a vernacular versus a post-vernacular. I think that was Geoffrey Chandler's term, post-vernacular, a language that used to be spoken but hangs on in different forms, either as individual words or because people remember it fondly or because they know that other people speak it. It's an extremely complicated question that we're only going to touch on today. We're not really going to have time to go into this, but it's interesting that in New York, at least, it seems like everybody knows at least a few words of Yiddish. For example, the father of Bill Thompson, who just lost the race for mayor, when he was first elected to office a number of years ago, they asked his father, who is most decidedly not Jewish, what he had to say about his son's election. He said, "Today is a day for me to have naches." And the New York Times reported that with a straight face. There was no need to explain what naches meant, and there was no need to say that this man isn't Jewish and probably only knows a few words of Yiddish, but feels perfectly comfortable using a Yiddish word in this context. So that's, to an extent, that's New York. Again, I don't know if we'll have time for it, but I'm curious to know how much that is, that's true outside of New York. We could also think about another question. Several people have pointed out that Yiddish is the language of the ultra-Orthodox. Yiddish also appeals to some extent to secular Yiddishists who might be said to be the other extreme, but people in the middle, Jews in the middle, not so much. Now, how did this happen? How did Yiddish come to be represent extremes? We will hear about how each of these various segments of the Jewish community looks at Yiddish, and as I said before, whether they transmit Yiddish to their children, and if so, how do they do it? And it would be great, again, if we could hear a little bit about, well, more than a little, about how this fits into their identity, what role Yiddish plays in Jewish identity, or even Jewish nationalism, if we can talk about that in the 21st century. But the most important thing is that our speakers have come armed with facts and not just vague generalizations the way I resorted to now. With that, I will turn the program over to our speakers, and we'll begin with Isabelle Barrière.
So thank you for having me here, and I will be presenting a talk with a perspective of a developmental psycholinguist and the policymakers studying Hasidic Yiddish. So Fishman in 1952 shared with us the view that Yiddish was ideal ground to examine sociolinguistics, which is a link between sociology and language. During this presentation, what I would like to make you appreciate is the fact that the current context of the acquisition of Hasidic Yiddish is an ideal kind of ground to answer many questions that we have about language acquisition and language transmission, and maybe also variation and change. And I will also be talking about what does this work tell us about current and possible optimal policies for the maintenance of Yiddish. I would like to start this presentation by sharing with you the fact that with this poem by Geoff about Columbus. This is Columbus Day today, and for linguists, Columbus Day is not a day when we are very happy because it's the beginning of the modern era of the destruction of many languages. And many years later, some varieties of Yiddish have suffered the fate of many languages that do not exist today, and other varieties may be endangered, and others have resisted. So I just wanted us to think about it today, not just as a day to celebrate Hasidic Yiddish or to study it, but also as a day to remember that there are many languages that disappear, and maybe we can do something about it. And in the course of this presentation, I will also mention a personal and dialogical connection to the Naomi Prawer Kadar, the reason why we are here today as well. So if we look at the field of developmental psycholinguistics, which is a study of language acquisition that started back with Chomsky in 1957 with his seminal thesis, trying to say that if we have a good theory of language, we need to explain how we develop language. Going from 57 to today, the shift has been on trying to explain not only how children acquire one language, but how we become multilingual, because the multilingual experience is a more common human experience. And one of the issues that people in this field kind of study is what kind of context enables children to develop language versus what kind of context doesn't. How much is necessary? How much is sufficient so that language is developed? I wanted to say that before I started the study I'm going to talk about today, I had very little connection with Yiddish or Judaism, not being Jewish myself and not being a Yiddish speaker. However, I discovered as I worked on this project that actually two of my very important mentors in the field are speakers of Yiddish. One was Celia Jakubowicz, who left us not that long ago, who was one of the person who established the field in France. She was actually from the same community as Niborsky, with parents from Vilnius, and she was born in Argentina, and her first language was Yiddish. And the second person is Bensi Wall, who actually went to shul with Naomi. And you see Bensi here singing. She's from a Yiddish-speaking and Belarusian-speaking background. And you see her on this picture singing because she's actually currently the specialist of studies of British Sign Language. And she's the person who trained me not only to study languages, but also to study languages in the context of minority languages, speakers of minority languages. So let's look at Yiddish today. Let's look at the context in New York. What is this context in which children are developing this language when they do? Well, Yiddish today is the 7th language other than English spoken in New York, if you look at the number of speakers. So it's a little bit less than French, but more than Korean, okay? So it's looking good, you know? And then if we, if we look at the neighborhoods where my study was conducted, Brooklyn Community District 1 includes Williamsburg, and Brooklyn Community District 12 includes Borough Park. What you see here is a map of Yeled Viarda Early Childhood Centers that spread around Brooklyn, but also Staten Island. And the areas that have been circled as those areas where you see blue dots are sites where the organization has preschools for children between the -3 months, the time the mother is pregnant, and 5 years of age, okay? And let's look at this neighborhood in terms of the number of Yiddish speakers. So if we take Brooklyn Community District 1, 15% of speakers in 2000 were speakers of Yiddish, which obviously the fact that they're all in a neighborhood kind of encourages the fact that they're going to use the language. But more impressively, it went through a very fast increase in terms of number of speakers. Okay, so if you look at this figure, as well as those for Brooklyn Community District 12, where we have 30% increase, we do not have a language that is endangered. Okay, that doesn't fit the criteria of endangered languages. And you know, if I apply for grant for endangered languages, I am not going to obtain them based on this data. Okay. So I'm going to be talking mostly about Williamsburg and Borough Park. And the reason why I'm not going to have time to talk about Northeastern, about Crown Heights, is because the pattern of transmission is a little different there. But I'll be happy to answer questions in the question period, okay? Instead of giving you a lot of figures, I'll give you some facts that has Paul Glasser asked us. And we're going to take the example of a child, Yaakov, who is a participant in the home-based early Head Start program at Yeled Viarda. And at the time he was studied in Williamsburg, at the time he was studied, he was 2 years and 9 months. Based on a detailed questionnaire on Yaakov, we know that he's the 5th child in his family. He has 3 older brothers and 2 sisters, one who is older and one who is younger. Both his parents are native speakers of Hungarian Yiddish, and they are both high school graduates, which is a kind of typical level of education for my participants. They exclusively use Yiddish at home. The only Yiddish is used at home, both with the parents and with siblings, and also during literacy-related activities. And Yaakov hears a little bit of English about 10% of the time from other caregivers, okay? So the question we can ask is, well, is this child exceptional? So I've conducted this kind of survey on more than 100 children at Yeled Viarda, close to 180 now. And here are the percentages. What you see in blue are children who are basically mainly, who hears most of the time Yiddish, okay? So you see that many of them hear only Yiddish. That's up to age 3. Okay, so up to 3 years of age, the 30% of the children hear only Yiddish, 43% hear 90% of Yiddish and 10% of English, 20% of the children hear 75% of English. Then the case of what we call in the literature balanced bilingual, which is represented in red here, is actually it's a very small proportion. Okay, so this is the kind of textbook bilingual you've heard about if you read about Canadian studies, etc. And this is actually a small proportion, and then there is a very small proportion as well of children who only hear about 10% of Yiddish. Okay, so let's learn a little bit more about Yaakov as an example. So we saw that in order to collect the data that I'm going to talk about, there are three sources of data that we use. One is a very detailed questionnaire on the linguistic and demographic context in which Yaakov is raised. Then there is a questionnaire in Yiddish that asks the parents which words and word combination the child produces. It's an adaptation of a clinical tools that we have adapted to Yiddish, and also audio recordings. And we have mother and child interacting at home in the context of symbolic play. So the Yiddish questionnaire tells us some information about Yaakov. He's 2 years, 9 months, so close to 3 years. He produces 414 words, which is a normal, typical vocabulary for a child of this age. And the reason why I've put all these pictures here is because I wanted to, I didn't want to forget to mention the fact that the questionnaire in Yiddish is not just a translation from the American English one, it's an adaptation that takes into account the culture of the child. So there are words that refer to Torah and challah bread, etc. There are all kinds of words that are specific to the culture, so that the questionnaire is adapted to the cultural community. We also learned from this questionnaire that Yaakov uses language to talk about things that are removed from the context, not just about the present. And also we learned that he produces pronouns like here, etc., preposition like mit. He has studied using the very complex system of plurals of Yiddish. He has studied using auxiliaries to mark tense. Of course, he uses diminutives and past participles. Okay. So let's hear now. I would like to play. So the recording lasted 30 minutes, but I'm only going to play you a minute of this recording. The total recording includes almost 500 utterances by the mother and 388 by Yaakov. And I'll just make you listen to it, and then we'll go through what we do with this data. So I hope.
Ben je Mami?
Ja.
Ja?
Welke?
En deze dag doen we een schaltje, de lady lunch. Eens gaan we best wel kochen, oké? Neem maar top. Wat zal je kochen?
Deze.
Wat zal je daar aangießen? Deze? Wat ze doen inside?
Zout.
Zout? Nu gieß er aan de top. Wow, jetzt laten we zien wat nou.
Ah, drinken.
Ah, jij zult het drinken? Wat is het gedaan jetzt?
Ja, maar dan is het niet drinken.
Als je jetzt getrinken, wat is het deze?
Een level.
Wat gaat het hier met de level?
Kijk, het missen.
Oké, mis je zo. En laten we zien.
Okay, so you see this this mother very happy with his child, interacting with him in Yiddish. So here you have the transcription. Sorry, I don't know why. Okay. Okay, I don't want this. Okay, never mind. Okay, I just wanted to say a few things about the transcription. So you have noticed that we're doing it in Roman letters. It's not because it wouldn't be interesting to do it in Yiddish. It's because these data are going to be made available on a database, and the database has programs to analyze language, and it's more the interface with Roman letters is better. So that created a problem, an issue we had to sort out in terms of which transliteration to use for Yiddish. And after many discussions with research assistants involved in this project, we decided to go with the Birnbaum transliteration because Birnbaum helps us capture the similarity and differences across the different varieties of Yiddish. So what we do is we transcribe this data, we check it twice, and then we analyze it. And what happens is that, so what you can see here are different constructions used by the mother. And I want you to pay attention to the fact that, for instance, a long sentence with the word lady, yes, there is a word in English, if you are very conservative about what you call English, but nevertheless, the actual structure of the sentence that I've maintained with the analysis here is very much Yiddish. Okay. Oops. I want the next slide. And the same here, you have a sentence with the word inside, but if you look at all the sentences, you have, again, you have Yiddish word order, Yiddish constructions, Yiddish morphology, etc. Okay. So what do we do and what have we learned? What's the use of doing all these works that you can imagine, especially the transcription, are very time-consuming and effortful. There are a lot of work. Well, we've learned a few things. We've learned, like, for instance, that there is an effect of percentage of exposure, how much a child spends hearing a language. It has a different effect on the vocabulary and the grammar. So if you look at the vocabulary, if you are dominant in Yiddish or whatever language you are hearing, your vocabulary is going to be, like that of a monolingual child at the same age. However, if you hear less of Yiddish, then you're going to slowly, your vocabulary in that language is going to decline. Okay, so here you have a break between 75% and 50%. In contrast, what happens for the grammar is a little bit different. That is that even though you may hear Yiddish only half of the time and English the other half of the time, your grammar is going to develop at the same speed as the grammar of monolingual, although you may have half the vocabulary. Okay, so that's a very interesting pattern, that the percentage of exposure doesn't have the same effect on all aspects of language development. Another thing that's very interesting, of course, is the fact that if you have a very low percentage of exposure, less than 25%, it's very unlikely that, at least at that age, that your language is going to take off. Okay, so this tells us something about if you want transmission to happen and to happen in an optimal way, there is no point in spending that much money sending your child to listen to a teacher in an expensive school for half a day, okay, in that language, whether it's Chinese or Yiddish or whatever. My results are very similar to those that have been reported for Yiddish-speaking communities. The second sets of findings have to do with, well, how much English is there in the mother's Yiddish. So we looked at, on all these utterances that the mother produced, I looked at the total number of words produced by the mother and how many of those could be classified as English. And I know that this can be tricky, okay? With the name of colors, you have words that sound very similar, like blue, for instance. So in that case, we go with the pronunciation. But even if you are very conservative about what you call English, so there is a lot of individual variation across different mothers. So some mothers mix very little, some mothers mix a bit more. But the 10% threshold that has been documented with the contact with other languages, like, for instance, Spanish, English, etc., or Russian, Hebrew, and by different researchers, like, for instance, Joel Walters in Israel, nobody goes above this. So it's a very typical pattern of what happens in situation of language contact. With respect to sentence structure, I didn't find that there is much effect of English. The most common second-person transmission, second-person construction with you that can, with a subject that can be omitted in Yiddish is the default, and this is very characteristic of Yiddish. This is not found in English. And also the word order of verb second and particle verbs having these different orders from English. It could be that my results are slightly different from those of my colleague Zelda Kahn-Newman, who I'm very happy is in this audience today. She works on language change in the Satmar community from generation to another, so a different look at transmission and change. And she reports slightly different findings. It is possible that the context in which the mother and the child play is a context that requires kind of relatively simple sentences. So if the mothers were telling discourse that were more complicated, maybe I would find something different, which is why I think I need to elicit a different kind of discourse as well when I get some funding to do so. What about the effects on word structure? Well, the effects of word structure are actually trickier. They are less clear-cut than what happened to syntax and vocabulary for now. So you have the cases of verbs being borrowed from English, like stop in that case, where it's very clear that the speaker is talking about the past, and the morphology of English is kept. So you have stopped, okay, just like English morphology. On the other hand, you have also the more frequent case of borrowing the root from English, like match or try here, and adding an ending that's Yiddish. And I know that it's the first match, the speaker was talking about the past, okay? And then tryen is not the English infinitive, it's a Yiddish infinitive, okay? Another example has to do with the use of diminutives. So we all know that in Yiddish, a lot of diminutives are used. So you have fischele and the interesting use of the word bunch in these speakers. And you have shtickle here. But there is also another diminutive that is used, E, that Fader in 2009 noticed. Now, she thinks that it's a direct result of English, of the influence of English. I think there are problems with this account. So if we think about the diminutive E in English, we have doggy, we have horsey. We don't say catty, we say kitten. I mean, if we say catty, it's an adjective. It's not a noun being a small cat. And it's restricted to a lexical class. It's restricted to nouns. So in English, you don't diminutivize verbs. What's happening with the E that the mothers are using in my recordings is that, yes, they are used with nouns like fishy and henty, but they're also used with verbs like happy and essy and schluffy, etc. Okay, so they do not behave like the English diminutives, okay, which even if it's a borrowing from English, it's probably a process of reanalysis. It's not just a simple borrowing. So, first conclusions. Yiddish is well and alive among Hasidic toddlers. Many of them are exposed to Yiddish enough so that they will be able to develop the language. There is a complex set of demographic and linguistic factors that characterize the context in which they are raised with these languages, and we can look at different variables. So I've mentioned a percentage of input in relation to pattern of development in vocabulary and grammar, but there are other variables to look at, like, for instance, the fact that when in language development we know that there are gender and sibling effects, so it would be very interesting to look at this in this population. I haven't talked much about this, but sometimes the two parents do not exactly speak the same variety of English. So, a variable there is variation in the input sometimes, although it's not the majority of children, but it happens. We also saw that the contact of English definitely has an effect on vocabulary, maybe on morphology, but not on syntax. And this is similar to the findings by Otegui for Spanish, published in 2010. Looking at spoken Yiddish today helps us understand what goes on in terms of language acquisition and change. And of course, we need to do a follow-up. So part of the mystery of E, we could also look at, if we had older recordings, we could tell when it started happening, and also eliciting more discourse, we could check other aspects of the syntax. Okay. I now want to turn to this. This is the Naomi Prawer Kadar lecture, and I understand from my reading about her and talking about her with my colleague and friends, Bensi Wall, that she was very attached to pedagogy, etc. So I thought I should say a few words about what does this research tell us in terms of education and language policies. So first of all, based on the project I've just talked about, we were able to develop assessment for children that are culturally and linguistically appropriate. And this is not the many linguistic minorities in New York do not have this kind of assessment. So we need to do a lot of work with this, including for Yiddish-speaking children. It also informed the dual language policies that's applied at Yeled Viarda. The dual language policy is a requirement by Head Start program today that says that it's not that you have to support the home language, but you have to be transparent about what you do in terms of introducing the child to English and supporting the home language. And so we have, the work that we have done on the different linguistic communities at Yeled Viarda enabled us to do that. And of course, the children are introduced to English in the preschool, but there is also a way to foster their continuing development for Yiddish. I know less about what's going on in schools. Also, I'm aware of the survey that was commissioned by the Fishman Foundation and conducted by Otegui and colleague in 2005, and also of the recent chapter by Mataris and Perlin in this book, Bilingual Community Education and Multilingualism, where across linguistic communities, including Yiddish, what seems to come out, to emerge, is that, lack of resources. So it's not the case that all languages receive an adequate amount of resources in order to be taught optimally in schools. And both Mataris and Perlin and the Otegui report make this point. Finally, in higher education, I just wanted to mention the fact that it's very difficult to find researchers who have the level of Yiddish today that is required to do the kind of analysis I was talking about. And also, I come from a department that trains speech and language pathology. There is a shortage of therapists who speak, therapists and educators trained in Yiddish, but there is also an issue with the current bilingual certification. The current bilingual certification for Yiddish requires, for instance, speakers of Hasidic Yiddish to learn a Yiddish that they don't speak and their clients do not speak because it doesn't match the variety of their client. And it's not unique to Yiddish. This is the same for, if you look at Spanish, the certification is for Mexican Spanish, not Dominican, Puerto Rican, etc. But this is a real issue in terms of the profession. Finally, I wanted to say that studying this community also has implications for a better understanding of language maintenance. And I hope I have shown as well that the Hasidic community doesn't go for standardization of the language, but this doesn't mean that they haven't been able to keep the language. So I think it's an interesting question for people interested in endangered languages. I wanted to thank my sponsors, PSC CUNY, for this study, and soon NSF for a study more focused on comprehension. The many students and colleagues who contributed to the development of the questionnaires, and for the transcription and analysis of the audio recordings. There are many people in this audience who contributed to this, and their names are here, Yaakov, Lazar, Pini, Mordechai, and Ricky. I also wanted to thank very, very much my colleagues at Yeled Vialda. I don't collect the data myself. The data that you heard was collected by a home visitor, so that means that a person the child is familiar with. And all the departments at Yeled Vialda have been so incredibly supportive of this research. And last but not least, I would like to thank the CEO of Yeled Vialda, Solomon Eagle, for an incredible vision in terms of letting me study the language of the community and helping develop assessment and the policies. Thank you very much.
Shalom Aleichem, Teire Freund, guten Abend. Welcome. Let's say you've been in New York for the past several months, that you know some Yiddish or are interested in Yiddish, but you don't belong to the kind of community that Isabelle just told us about, where Yiddish is still the vernacular, the language of the home, the language of the streets. But you still, just in these past several months, could have belted out Yiddish folk songs at a zingerai, a sing-along at a Bronx sukkah, gotten down at Tanzhoiz, a Yiddish dance party, heard Yiddish songs interspersed with Indian Bhangra music in Brooklyn, which was amazing, by the way, studied Torah off Mama Loshen at an egalitarian yeshiva, harvested garlic on a Yiddish-speaking farm, gut verbracht, had a good time hanging out at Yiddish Hoiz, an apartment in Brooklyn, the owners of which, or renters of which, are here with us tonight, where you can always hear a Yiddish word. Savored Yiddish poetry at Sicko, a Yiddish bookstore in Queens, with somewhat irregular hours. But also here on this very stage from the lips of Evgeny Kissin several months ago, who also writes Yiddish poetry of his own. You could have spent Rosh Hashanah with a group of young people in Washington Heights, all in Yiddish except for the services, of course. You could have had an existential crisis, a very Yiddish-lach one, seeing Warten auf Godot, Waiting for Godot, which was recently produced. You could have joined a Lehenkreis, a reading group, probing the stories of Avram Karpinovich, wonderful stories of interwar Vilna. You could have sung forgotten gems of the American Yiddish repertoire at the Jewish People's Philharmonic Chorus, which produces a big concert every year. This is just New York. This is just the past several months. New York is admittedly the capital of Yiddish, but it provides a good introduction to the kinds of spaces that I'm going to be talking about, where Yiddish lives in all kinds of different ways. My brief was to talk about sort of alternative Yiddish spaces. Alternative is a funny word. It's in a sense just sort of a catch-all in this case for non-Orthodox spaces, although the kinds of places I'm talking about are sort of don't pattern necessarily by religion or religious affiliation, I should say. They are spaces where, indeed, even non-Jews are speaking Yiddish and enjoying Yiddish. Now, these spaces do have certain things in common, though, that need to be kind of underlined, and Paul mentioned some of them earlier. They're often, not always, institutional in the sense that there's probably an organization behind them, usually a 501c3 of some kind. This is institutional in a good sense. They're formal often in the sense that they are happening at certain places and times. You can find out about them. These things are largely just sort of open to whoever wants to come. They're performative in some sense, that people are often speaking English until the moment they get there. And of course, many people at these events still are speaking English. But they are spaces in which it's understood that you can hear Yiddish and speak Yiddish if you like and if you're able to. So these are the kinds of spaces I'm going to be talking about. And I should say, just from the get-go, on the one hand, we need to relish and enjoy and celebrate and extend and support, as the Naomi Foundation is doing tonight, indeed, these kinds of spaces and recognize how rich New York is in them and other places as well. On the other hand, we need to be realistic about the limitations of such spaces. They are what I'll refer to often as post-vernacular spaces, and I'll explain that in a moment. And I have to reflect the sort of bittersweet comment that's sometimes made that Yiddish has as many poets as it has speakers, or at least Kulturtours, people who do culture, which I think is a particularly geschmack, lovely Yiddish word, which means kind of the opposite of a culture vulture who consumes culture, but somebody who makes culture and creates culture. And in some ways, it's a wonderful situation to be in where many of the people who are involved in this secular Yiddish world or non-Orthodox Yiddish world, if we can bound it that way, are not just speakers but culture creators and are actively involved. There's very little passive work happening here. Everybody's actively contributing to these environments that I'm talking about. So it's a small world to a certain extent, especially if you compare it with the amazing amount of activity that there once was. But we need to be appreciative of it and understand it nonetheless. So I want to address kind of three questions in my remarks. I wish I had a fourth so that I could have the youngest person in the room kind of take these on. But three is still the magic number in the English, kind of the English world. One, what is the current state of what we're calling secular or let's say non-Orthodox, non-Haredi Yiddish? Where does it live and what forms does it take? Second question, and I think this was first raised in these terms by a Kulturtour, Rochel Kafrisian, in an article in the Forwards. Can we start talking about continuity and not just revival? There's this trope of Yiddish revival, which has been in the air for multiple decades now. And when can we get beyond that and move to talk of continuity, continuing that revival, extending it? The third question, what role for secular, non-Haredi Yiddish when the vast majority of active speakers are indeed already at this point Haredim, Hasidim, as we've heard already from Isabelle? What is going to be the relationship of those communities, which is a huge question. And again, I'm only going to be able to touch briefly on these, but I want to just provide kind of an overview while we can. Starting with where things currently stand. It's probably well known to all of you, and this is an audience of Kulturtour, I've noticed. I mean, we have in the room people who are active in all spheres of the events that I just spoke of, and all spheres of kind of Yiddish speaking life. So it's an honor and it's intimidating to speak in front of such an audience. But in terms of where we stand, it should be recognized that Yiddish is not kind of an isolated case. There are very specific historical tragedies and specific situations that have led to the current state of Yiddish and the massive drop-off in non-Haredi speakers. But we should recognize that this is also part of these broader patterns of language change going on around the world. That Jewish languages, in general, the languages of the Jewish diaspora, are reflecting, for their own reasons, but also along with larger global trends, language endangerment patterns that are going on all over the world. And there are people working on these things and indeed often making use of things from Yiddish. The work of people like Joshua Fishman and Uriel Weinreich has contributed greatly to the larger understanding of global language endangerment. And there's a lot that can be gained from that back and forth. But we first need to acknowledge the continued, almost miraculous existence of native speakers, not Haredi native speakers, but also semi-speakers, passive speakers, semi-passive speakers, heritage speakers, the Bissell crowd, as I think of them, everybody who goes around saying, I speak a Bissell. And Paul alluded to this before, and I think it's difficult to know what to do with this range of this range of competence, which is very difficult to measure. Even linguists have tried developing batteries of tests to try to understand it, but it's very hard to know what to do with that, and it's very hard to kind of connect people, who are at all of these different levels. Of course, first language Yiddish speakers from, especially from Eastern Europe, have long been a kind of gold standard. But obviously, we need to be kind of looking beyond that at this point. I think already the fact that we're talking about Haredi Yiddish and that it's not being sort of dismissed, and that that we're understanding that the language is changing, and speakers of all kinds have something to kind of contribute, and need to be sort of engaged and brought together. Indeed, most of what we might think of as elders, as they would be called in a lot of other language communities, we're not born in Shtetlach and Derfelach, but in the last, speaking again about the non-Haredi world, in the last large-scale non-Haredi Yiddish-speaking environments, places like the Bronx and Brooklyn in the 1930s and even into the 1940s, the DP camps, certain places in the Soviet Union, certain places in the Pale of Settlement until a surprisingly late time, as the wonderful AHAIM project has made clear, if you haven't checked that out. There's already a kind of a divide just in this small kind of secular Yiddish-speaking world that I mentioned between often what older people are doing in Yiddish clubs. There's a world of Yiddish clubs, especially different places around the country. Older people often coming together to kind of, just to kind of hear a Yiddish word, to say a Yiddish word. It's often not very connected to the kind of very intensive activity and focus on fluency that Yiddishists, whether or not they like that term, are engaged in. So there's a gap to be bridged there. But in terms of the world of Yiddishists, who may or may not like that term, the New York area is obviously is very much a center. There is a core of families who have had an outsized influence as Kulturtour in this world, where there's been unbroken transmission, very, very valuably and importantly, and it has helped and inspired other families to be, as it were, linguistic balchuvas, to kind of, Yiddish skipped a generation in my family, or 2 generations, but you can sort of come back to it as long as there are people around that you can go to. And Yiddish is comparatively a very well-resourced language, we could say, because of all of this work that's gone on, dictionaries and websites and so much that many people in this room have made possible. So we're talking about a small, sometimes fragile, perhaps in the larger frame, still shrinking vernacular speech community. But to some extent, there is also what we might think of as a meta-linguistic community. Among the 10 million or so Jews of Ashkenazi background around the world, probably the majority of them here in the United States, there is very variable degrees of awareness of Yiddish as being kind of in the family background. Obviously, some people there's almost no awareness, but to some extent, this constitutes a kind of metalinguistic community, and Sarah may touch on some of this, where where words have come into people's English, where there's a connection to Yiddish style humor and so on, and that metalinguistic community is still kind of is there sort of in the background in some sense, and there's always this kind of idea of how to kind of how to engage it and how to sort of draw from it, for the sort of fuller story on this, I recommend a dissertation by Neda Avineri, it was just published last year, which is called Heritage Language Socialization Practices in Secular Yiddish Educational Contexts, the Creation of a Metalinguistic Community. So what she's saying there is that a kind of metalinguistic community out of the, this large number of people who have Yiddish in their family backgrounds as a heritage language, there have been people emerging, the people that I'm talking about. It's not huge numbers, but there is a passion there to constitute a kind of metalinguistic community where people come together in these kinds of situations that I've mentioned, whether it's a zingerai, a sing-along, or a reading group, or a language program, or a klezfest, and I'll mention a few more of those kinds of spaces in a moment. Paul mentioned this term post-vernacularity. I mentioned it briefly. highly recommend Geoffrey Chandler's book, Adventures in Yiddish Land, where he really kind of goes deep into post-vernacular Yiddish culture, where people may be wearing T-shirts that have Yiddish on it, but they don't actually speak any Yiddish, or they speak only a little bit. And what is the meaning of that, and what should we make of that? Post-vernacularity is defined by Chandler as a secondary or meta level of signification, where the symbolic value invested in the language is apart from the semantic value of any given utterance in it. Which is to say that it's just, whatever you may be saying, if you're saying it in Yiddish, the medium is the message. The fact that you're speaking Yiddish is, a big part of what you're saying and a very important aspect of it. And so post-vernacular activities do put a kind of extra emphasis often on reading, performing, studying. It can be for people more like a hobby or something that they're enthusiastic about rather than rather than something that they're just doing without even thinking about it. And that brings up a great deal of challenges. But I think the title of a recent book that came out called Choosing Yiddish, a collection of essays of sort of contemporary, fascinating kind of Yiddish studies, is very telling. It's a choice for these communities or for these people. It's a choice not just at a larger level of I want to learn Yiddish. It's a choice every moment in every context, in each person you talk to. Am I going to speak Yiddish now, or am I not? So on the one hand, that means that it's charged with a certain sense of volition and passion and so on. On the other hand, it means it doesn't have that kind of reflexive character where it's just ingrained at a deep level. Briefly, just mentioning some of these post-vernacular spheres for Yiddish, many of them new, leading to some optimism that Yiddish is in certain ways advancing or going into spaces where it wasn't before. The internet, notably, a rich kind of ecosystem of Yiddish websites. The whole range of university and summer courses, which YIVO really helped kick off, but is now kind of spread globally. As I've mentioned, Yiddish on T-shirts, Yiddish mentioned in hip-hop lyrics, Yiddish farm, Yiddish Woch, which has now been going on for several decades. Is a week-long kind of intensive space where people can live in Yiddish. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but there's an astounding range of organizations that are still, that still exist. The Yiddish Book Center, the Jewish People's Philharmonic Chorus, newspapers and magazines, 2 theaters here in New York and theaters elsewhere that we're going to kind of see all brought together, hopefully, at an international Yiddish theater festival coming up soon here in New York. A whole range of things that are going on, and the question is just, can we support them all? Can we support them and develop them all, and also not stretch ourselves too thin? I think those of us who are engaged in these activities, and of course there are more informal efforts as well. Just get-togethers, people just without any kind of institutional backing, and it's going on. I think there's a question about whether Yiddish can be sort of, remain close in some sense, even when people are not learning it. That it feels familiar, both because of its kinship with the English, both because of its relationship to the sort of Jewish English that Sarah may mention that is developing. I think there is always a kind of an ambiguity in these kinds of spaces that I'm talking about. Which, as I say, are largely, but not entirely, post-vernacular spaces where Yiddish is living, but it's kind of performed. On the one hand, people feel that they're returning to a certain kind of authenticity. On the other hand, there is a sense that it is an artificial space, that it is a bounded space. So briefly, moving on to the second question, can we talk about continuity and move beyond revival, or build on the notion of revival? I think the trope of Yiddish revival begins sort of in the 1960s and 70s, at least this most recent trope, and it was a time of general kind of roots-seeking among many minority groups in the United States, and then even beyond the United States. And the numbers may not have been that great. There was always, kind of endless media articles about Yiddish revival, but the question was always still, how many new speakers are being produced, again, in the non-Haredi world. And I think it's not yet clear whether the sort of roots-seeking generation, the people who kind of created a lot of the institutions and spaces that I've mentioned, who are responsible for the revival, whether that generation is fully reproducing itself among people of my generation, as someone who's 30. And I think it's been interesting to watch different aspects of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage be revived kind of at different times and to different degrees. I think food being one of the most interesting kind of recent ones, seeing the sort of New Delhi movement and new Ashkenazi food movement. And we still don't know kind of, how far these revivals will go and to what extent they'll really take root. And it depends on a whole range of factors over which I think we have little control. Broader trends in American life, the degree of kind of multiculturalism in the society that's acceptable, the extent of root seeking and the search for authenticity, which is to some extent behind it. In her kind of initial call to talk about continuity and not just revival, Rochel challenged a Jewish foundation to sponsor a study of young people active in Yiddish culture. And I still don't think it's really been done, at least in a kind of comprehensive way. All the people, and it probably numbers in the thousands now, who've gone through Klezfests and language programs and so on and so forth, to really understand where have they gone and what have they done with that experience. Of course, it's never going to be that a majority of those people necessarily are going to stay kind of in the fold. People move on to various things, and again, as I say, for some people it will be a hobby, it will be a kind of community of practice or interest, something they do for a while. But I think it's something that remains out there to do, is to kind of study that, people who've been through that experience. We've now had these spaces, some of them, for quite a while. And how do you keep people engaged? There's often a kind of divide between younger people who are discovering this stuff for the first time, or are at college age or recently out of college, and then people who are older who are now retired and have the opportunity to kind of look into these things. What about that middle group? Those are the people who would be potentially raising children, have their careers to work on and all sorts of things. But I feel like there's often a kind of a gap of people kind of in their 30s, 40s, and 50s in the kinds of Yiddish spaces that we're talking about. So the good news, I think, is that the stigma around Yiddish is largely disappearing, and that's part of what has kind of driven some of this activity. I think there are relatively few people in their 20s who really feel that this is, the language von der Blotte, from the mud, from the muck of the old world. And the bad news is that maybe that there are no associations at all, and that people don't even sort of know what Yiddish is. Is it like Hebrew? What is it? And again, the good news is the multiplicity of institutions that we have already. The bad news is potentially of being split too thin, or indeed splittist, as sometimes happens with Yiddish organizations. So there are kind of questions about ongoing Yiddish cultural literacy, even among people who don't speak Yiddish. And I probably have to mention at least briefly the Pew Survey, which was recently released and is kind of the talk of the American Jewish street. And if 27% of Americans of Jewish background consider themselves Americans of Jewish background and see very little other connection to that, I think that's an indication of Yiddish cultural literacy, also kind of to some extent in free fall as well. But then there's the sort of 62% of respondents in those surveys who said that being Jewish is mainly a matter of ancestry and culture. And I think there is, again, that thing which many people in this room and many people in the Yiddish world have been saying for a long time, that Yiddishkeit, broadly speaking, is this kind of missing link, that if you could sort of connect people who see this as a matter of ancestry and culture to some of the content, that would add an essential component. And I think some of the newer efforts, like Tent from the Yiddish Book Center, like the Helix Project from Yiddishkeit Los Angeles, represent some idea of connecting people to the sort of broadly defined Yiddishkeit. So I'm running low on time, so I'll skip to the third question very briefly, kind of address the role of the relationship between kind of the world of secular non-Haredi Yiddish with the vast majority of speakers who are now Haredim. I think one of the biggest questions out there at this point is how to build a bridge between these communities. As I say, the spaces that I'm talking about are not split along lines of religious affiliation, but they're largely non-Haredi. But there are powerful examples of people who are working to build those bridges, including Yiddish Farm, including efforts through the internet, which are sometimes easier, an easier place, safer spaces for secular Yiddishists, for lack of a better word, to meet with Haredi Yiddish speakers and have conversations. There are things like Cholent, the gathering of Chassidim and people who are curious about Chassidim, and Chassidim who are curious about non-Chassidim, and so there are all kinds of questions out there about the attitudes of different groups within this. People who are leaving the Hasidic world, but were raised with Yiddish. What role will they play as they enter non-Hasidic society? Baal Tshuvas who are moving into the more religious world, and who may be acquiring some Yiddish or acquiring Yiddish as they do that, what role will they play? There are many potential kind of bridges here. And there's the question that's been raised of a kind of new Hasidic Haskola, maybe most famously by David Katz. And I'll just briefly kind of read his quote. Secular literary Yiddish can be saved not as a physical society with streets and squares, but as a virtual network of small, serious islands of culture and creativity in the internet age. It is alive when a Yiddish literature seminar or summer course is conducted in Yiddish with the original texts, with students who write their papers in Yiddish and discuss their work in Yiddish. It can be alive in a city apartment or a forest hut when an individual writes and thinks in the language. While the next major chapter in the unfinished history of Yiddish is created by the Hasidim, we islanders, the world of secular Yiddish, can muster the collective energy needed for efforts to write our own much smaller chapter. As a Hasidic Grand Master of old once put it, Kol zman das kleinschike Lichterl brennt, kann man noch verrichten. As long as that tiny candle burns, it can still all be put right. Moreover, small is beautiful. And that's how he ends Words of Fire, the unfinished history of Yiddish that he wrote. And that's the note on which I will end. I think there are all kinds of questions that it raises. I think Haredi Yiddish is an unavoidable subject, and a subject that should be embraced by people in the secular Yiddish world, and I think that challenge is ongoing. There's very little in terms of pedagogical materials, very little research relatively, besides what Isabelle and Zelda and a few others are doing on the whole question of Haredi Yiddish. And there are questions about different Yiddish dialects and their fate as well. But there needs to be engagement and exchange. I think it's the conclusion that many people in the secular Yiddish world have come to. The question is how to do it and preserve who we are and whoever that may be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here and to share the stage with these excellent researchers and speakers. And it's really an honor to speak to an audience that includes some former teachers of mine, including Robert Shapiro and David Roskies, who taught a class that Naomi and I were both students in when she was a grad student and when I was an undergrad at Columbia. So I'm really happy to be able to be here now on this stage. I think I was on this stage once before when I graduated from the YIVO summer program one summer, and I sang my Yiddish version of Porgy and Bess, which was Zumer Zeit und die Jiddelech schwitzen. And it was there's Best ihr seid mein Rebbe it's. Meirev-Zeit und Schachris-Zeit und Musif-Zeit und Minche-Zeit. Ich will sein bei euch. So, yeah, that was, that's all I remember from that show. But today I want to talk about Yiddish words that are used within English, especially by Jews. So when you hear that phrase, what words come to mind? What Yiddish words do you think of that are used within English? Nachis, schlep, schmutz, schmier, chutzpah, ment, schmooze. Okay, so a lot of the words that you mentioned are words that are used mostly by Jews, but some of those words are also used by non-Jews, have spread throughout our society. And my question for you is, would you say that these words are increasing in use or decreasing in use? Increasing. I heard a unanimous increase. Did anyone say decreasing? A few people. Okay, but most people said increasing. Okay. Well, I did some research to answer this question, and I'm going to present research from two sources today. One is quantitative data from my survey of American Jewish language and identity, which I conducted with Stephen Cohen, and qualitative data from my book, Becoming Frum. So first, we have a number of words that are, in fact, decreasing within American English among Jews. So this is from the survey, and we had over 30,000 respondents. And here I'm just reporting the data from Jews who grew up speaking only English. Okay, so we find that nachis is decreasing. So you see that younger people, these are the ages on the bottom, younger people use it less than older people. Same with Hamish. Okay. Mensch is pretty stable, a bit of a decline in the younger generations, but most of the Jews that we surveyed say they use the word mensch. But then we also get a number of words that are increasing, especially in the religious domain. So shul is an example of that, and I also have historical data from the American Jewish press that shows that this word has really increased, especially since the 70s and 80s. Lane is another example of one that's increasing, used more by the younger generations. And in addition to words, we have the same kind of thing with grammatical construction. So staying by us instead of staying at our house is increasing in the younger generations. So we have some words that are increasing, and not only in the religious domain, but also phrases like enough already and money shmoney, Drosh, Good Shabbos, Lane, and Bench. Some words that are decreasing, especially these words that you might associate with older Jews, Maven, Nachas, Macher, Nu, Bashert, Taka, and Hamish. And then some that have little change, including klutz and spiel, two words that are very common among our non-Jewish respondents, and mensch and schmutz, which are not quite as common but are still known by a lot of non-Jews. So the question is why? Why are some of the words decreasing and some increasing? Well, the decrease is kind of expected. We have shifted away from the generation of immigration, so you would expect that the words from Yiddish would gradually diminish. The increase is a bit more surprising, and it has to do with two things. One is the fact that some of these words have spread beyond the Jewish community, and so once non-Jews pick them up, it makes sense that Jews in the younger generations will use them too. And schmooze is a good example of that. But with schmooze, it's a word that has changed in its meaning and usage as it has spread beyond the Jewish community. So what does the word schmooze mean? To talk. But I heard someone say network. So those are kind of different, right? So to talk and to network, I didn't bring a slide about schmooze, but in our survey we actually tested those two meanings and found that those who have more Jewish friends are more likely to have the chat meaning, and those who have more non-Jewish friends are more likely to have the network meaning. But even in the 5 years since I did the survey, I think that has changed, and more people understand it to mean to network, and use it as a transitive verb, to schmooze someone, right? In Yiddish, it's not transitive. You just schmooze. You don't schmooze. You can schmooze with someone, but you can't schmooze someone. And it's also used in the phrase to schmooze up, like he schmoozed up the vice president during the party, right? That it comes from to chat up, right? It's analogous to chat up. Okay, so you have these words that are increasing outside of the Jewish community and therefore increasing within the Jewish community in the younger generations. But then you have this surprising increase in religious words. And this is what I want to focus on for the rest of the talk. So remember I showed you this slide of staying by us? This is among Jews in general. But when we look just at Orthodox Jews, the age difference is much more striking. Orthodox Jews in the younger generations are much more likely to say staying by us than in the older generations, okay? So this has to do with the fact that this phrase and other Yiddish words and grammatical constructions are an important part of Orthodox identity. And we see this with a number of phrases. So let's look at staying by us by denomination. You see how in the Orthodox categories, the three on the right, it's much more common than among non-Orthodox Jews and non-Jews. Same with coming to us. Some people don't even realize that coming to us is not standard English. In standard English, you would say coming to our house. But coming to us, which is so common among Orthodox Jews and even among some non-Orthodox Jews, is an influence from Yiddish. Same thing with take, chas v'shalom, Hebrew origin word from Yiddish. To learn out, which is a phrase, arois lernen or ois lernen, which is a phrase that comes from Yiddish used within Orthodox communities. And here we really do see gradations among the different Orthodox groups. And name preferences. I asked about a number of names. How likely would you be to give names like these to your children? And the Yiddish origin names Moshe, Mendy, Basia, and Fredi are much more common in the Orthodox circles, especially in the Black Hat community. Now, of course, this relates to Yiddish knowledge within these Orthodox communities. So this slide comes from a study that I did using data from Frumster.com, which used to be a dating website for Orthodox Jews. And when you sign up for Frumster, you have to say what hashkafa or what orientation you subscribe to, or how you would categorize yourself. And 4 of the options are Modern Orthodox Liberal, Modern Orthodox Machmir, Yeshivish Modern, and Yeshivish Black Hat. And so I looked at how these respondents in the different categories and separated by gender correlated with various things. And this slide shows Yiddish knowledge, those who list Yiddish as one of the languages that they know. Now, we don't know how well they know it or if they even do, but the fact that they list it, you see, correlates very strongly with their selected category, especially among men. Men have greater Yiddish knowledge in all of the categories except for Modern Orthodox Liberal. Okay, so it makes sense that people who have more Yiddish knowledge would be more likely to use certain Yiddish words within their English. And I certainly found this to be the case in the community where I did my field work for my book, Becoming Frum. So just a little bit about my methodology. It was an ethnographic study where I spent a year hanging out in the community, and I also did some sociolinguistic studies, recording people, interviewing them, asking them about language, and doing an experiment about language. And this was in an Orthodox community in Philadelphia in 2001 to 2002. On the continuum of religiosity, where we have Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox in the middle, this community is on the Black Hat end of the continuum, and there are Hasidim and non-Hasidim. This community where I did my research is not Hasidic. They wouldn't refer to themselves as Yeshivish, but maybe Yeshivish Modern is the category that they would select if they were going to be on Frumster.com. So a little bit about the language in the community. The community is mostly English speakers. There were very few people there who were actually able to speak Yiddish. One who did study in a yeshiva outside of the community where they learned Yiddish, but very few who could. But most are descended from Yiddish speakers. And most are proficient in Hebrew for prayer and study. And the men also study Aramaic rabbinic texts. So because of these contacts with Yiddish, Hebrew, and Aramaic, they have some influences in their English from those languages, words from those languages, Hebrew words pronounced in Ashkenazi ways and with Ashkenazi forms, like periphrastic verbs, like we do all that shtick to be misameach, the chosin and kale. And so words like that are also transitive, it doesn't really make sense in English grammar, but it comes from a Yiddish periphrastic construction. Then we also have distinctive English pronunciation in vowels and consonants. We have a number of grammatical influences from Yiddish, very distinctive intonation patterns. If you've heard it, you know what I'm talking about. And then we have a number of features that I think come from modern Israeli Hebrew, because some of the people in the community spend time in Israel in yeshivas there, and then come back having picked up some of the Israeli Hebrew features. So one of those is the click. We were walking around and whatever, it's not important. Do you hear that click? Okay, so that click is very contagious, and I'm sorry if I just passed it on to you, but that click is very common in Orthodox communities and is used in, told you it's very contagious. It's used even by people who've never been to Israel. There's also the so, which I think comes from Israeli Hebrew because I can't find a Yiddish analog, and I have heard it more among people who have spent time in Israel. It's something like this. If you go there, so you'll understand. That so is analogous to the Israeli Hebrew az, and it would make sense that it would come from Yiddish, but I can't think of a way that it would, because in that position in the sentence, Yiddish would have a verb. So that so is a common feature in Orthodox Jewish English. Let me give you some examples of how this works within English sentences. This is a sentence from a lecture by a rabbi before Pesach. He said, the mitzvah of the matzah by the Seder should be, we're machmir, it's a chumrah to have shmura mishas haktsira, that the wheat that is harvested for Pesach should be already watched from the time of the harvest. Okay, so you have, in addition to all the underlined words from Hebrew, and you can see with the Ashkenazi pronunciations, we have the by, and we have the wheat, where the T is released at the end of a word, which I've found to be very common in Orthodox communities, and that already influenced by Yiddish shoin. Another quote, this is from an interview with Mrs. Adler. These are all pseudonyms. In another community, people might, if they have a different sort of Yiddishkeit, so they might not daven in the same shul. They might send their kids to different yeshivas. Okay, so in addition to the Yiddish and Hebrew words there, we have the click, and we have that so, and a bit of distinctive intonation as well. Now, people in the community are aware that they speak in a distinctive way, and there's a dictionary called From Speak, the First Dictionary of Yeshivish. I recommend it. It's a very good book, and it has a nice, actually scholarly essay at the beginning explaining how this language works. And there's even a song called Yeshiva Charade, and I'm going to play a little bit for you right now. It gives sentences from yeshiva-style language and talks. Yeshiva Charade means yeshivish-style speech. So enjoy for a minute.
To originate a language, a new way to talk and speak, is a most imposing challenge, a monumental feat. It takes a special talent, is not for the faint of heart, and most are doomed to failure before they even start. But in the hallowed halls of yeshivos far and wide, our young men have discovered a new way to verbalize. With Yiddish, English, Hebrew, it's a mixture of all three, and a dash of Aramaic, a linguistic potpourri that's called
Okay, so you hear it's the talk of the town, mamish tog und nacht. So just in that one sentence, you hear the Hebrew words, the Yiddish words, and the New York accent, right? Now, this language, distinctive way of speaking English in the Orthodox community, is so important that many of the newcomers to the community, the Balei Tshuva, pick it up. So in my study, I found a number of people for whom this language was very important. An example of this is Rivka Bracha, who grew up as Rebecca, and then when she became frum, which means religious, she changed her name to Rivka, and then eventually Rivka Bracha, because if you're frum, you have to have two names, not all, right, but as one Bal Tshuva joked to me, mimicking Lenny Bruce, he said, Yaakov, Dov, Tzvi, not from Yaakov Tzvi, from. So Rivka Bracha, also, again a pseudonym, really did pick up a lot of the Orthodox language. She used many Hebrew and Yiddish words, clicks, word final T release, distinctive intonation, and a number of Yiddish grammatical influences, even things that I didn't hear often from people who grew up from. Like, this is not what to record, she said to me once. I didn't like when she said that, but at least I got that one on tape, so okay. So Rivka Bracha was picked up the language so well that an FFB, that's from birth, woman, cast her, that's a term that's used in the community, an FFB woman cast her as the Yiddish Bubby from Borough Park in the women's Purim spiel. And this was a great source of pride for her. She was actually very proud that she was cast in this role. She felt that was a sign that she had picked up the language well enough to be able to play a grandmother who speaks Yiddish. And she said, I don't speak the good King's English anymore. I speak this Yinglish yeshivish stuff, which is fine by me. Okay, so while some people do pick up these features, some more than others, Rivka Bracha is an extreme example, but some actually avoid Yiddishisms. For example, Joseph avoids the oi sound in words like Torah because he thinks that it's inauthentic for someone who's not Hasidic and didn't grow up using it. And similarly, Shelley doesn't say the by, like staying by them, because she sees it as bad grammar, which is also an ideology that I've heard from FFBs, from people who themselves grew up from. Okay, so clearly Yiddishisms are important in American Orthodox identities, important enough that even newcomers to the community often pick them up. And we also see differences along the continuum from modern Orthodox to black hat. So how do these Yiddishisms spread? What allows people who don't speak Yiddish to incorporate new Yiddish words into their English? Well, it's very hard to track this, and I don't know a methodology to really track this unless someone created a word and then actually tracked it to see how it spread, but even that is very hard to do. So this is all kind of conjecture, my hypothesis about how they spread. I think they spread when Yiddish-speaking Black Hat Orthodox Jews interact with English-speaking Black Hat Orthodox Jews, bilinguals in at least one of those categories, who interact with modern Orthodox Jews, who interact with non-Orthodox Jews, and words like bench and staying by us transfer along throughout these communities until even Reform Jews use the word bench sometimes, and they don't have any contact with the Black Hat Yiddish speakers, but it must have been conveyed throughout the communities through overlapping networks. And you see the same kind of spread through overlapping networks when words spread from Yiddish-speaking immigrants to the general American population, from Yiddish-speaking immigrants to English-speaking Jews who are children or friends of immigrants to non-Jews. And so words like klutz and spiel and maven get transferred this way with some input from the Borscht Belt and from the media and from things like Seinfeld and the Jews in Hollywood who write scripts that include a lot of Yiddish words. So to sum it all up, some Yiddishisms are decreasing among American Jews, some are increasing in American English and in religious Jewish circles, and some Yiddishisms are important in American Orthodox identities, and finally, Yiddishisms spread from group to group. So now you can get a sense of why I chose those three words for the title of this talk, mensch, bench, and paskin, aside from the fact that they kind of sound cool together, because mensch is one of these words that has become kind of common in American English, but is still associated with Jews. Bench is one of these words that is used by non-Orthodox Jews and by Orthodox Jews. And paskin, which means to give a religious ruling, is used almost solely among Orthodox Jews. So a number of Yiddish words that just show how diverse our community is with respect to post-vernacular Yiddish use. Thank you very much.
Where to start? We're actually running a little late, so we're going to have to cut the discussion short. So, do you three feel up to discussing without my throwing questions at you? Or, I mean, actually, let me throw something out. Actually, never mind that. We haven't talked that much about identity. We've only touched on it briefly. So, can you discuss, from your points of view, how important Yiddish is to Jewish identity today? In no particular order.
Okay, so I will start with talking a little bit about the community I'm studying. I think it's actually a very difficult question because the first thing about Hasidic groups is that there are different groups and they relate differently to Yiddish, and it's definitely important to their identity in terms of the tie between Yiddish and the culture. And part of raising the child with Yiddish rather than English has to do with making sure that the culture is transmitted. On the other hand, Yiddish is not that important that when people are matched in terms of marriages, an interesting thing that I wish we had time to touch upon, but with the Hasidic community, it's at the same time a very local culture and a very global culture, because there are a lot of marriages between people from England or Israel or Australia to people here, etc. So there is some kind of global culture going on. But having a language in common is what's important for the bride and the groom. It doesn't have to be Yiddish, okay? But that, having said this, at some level, given the number of children that there are in the community, the fact that maybe, if you have 6 or 10 children, between 6 and 10 children, if only half your children are going to transmit Yiddish to the next generation, you're still okay. So I think it's a very... So maybe that's a recipe for endangered languages. I don't know, so it's a very tricky issue because I think it's very tied to the culture, but it's not what makes you the person of that Hasidic or that other Hasidic group.
Well, they certainly don't consider it an end in itself. It's a means to an end for them.
Yeah, I think so.
But it's an important means to them.
Yeah, definitely.
I think broadly speaking, in the secular Jewish world, Reform, conservative, you could say the importance of Yiddish to people's identity is in some sense latent, or it's could be activated. There is a connection to, as I said, ancestry and culture is kind of continually brought forward among American Jews as a crucial component of identity, and there will be associations with pastrami and Seinfeld, and as somebody joked right after the Pew Survey, 98% of Jews ask the question, where can I get a good bagel in this town? And there is this cultural connection without necessarily an awareness that it connects to an actual language or what the content of that language is, except for maybe a few words. So I think, in general, the whole sort of cultural complex that Yiddish is sort of the engine of or is behind is very much a part of identity for those Jews who are secular, Reform, conservative, and identify with that. But Yiddish, the language, the specifics of it, as I say, remains often a very kind of latent or hidden thing.
Yeah, and I would add to that Yiddish is used for identity purposes for many people, not just Jews. We haven't really talked about non-Jews who are interested in Yiddish, but there are certainly many, and in America, but also in Germany and Eastern Europe. And I think for many of them, it is an important part of their identity as Germans or as Poles, to learn the language of a group that no longer exists in your society. But then I think also within American society, Yiddish words play an important role in American Jewish identity, and I don't think it's always associated with Ashkenazim. For example, in my survey, I found that people who do not have Yiddish ancestors are just as likely to use some of the Yiddish words, the ones in the religious domain, like shul, for example, or daven. And you do hear those kinds of words in Sephardi and Mizrahi communities. So at this point, Yiddish influences and Ashkenazi Hebrew are to some extent markers of religiosity more than they are of Ashkenazi heritage and Yiddishist identity. However, of course, there are many people for whom Yiddish is very important as a marker of their connection to their ancestors, whether it was transmitted from generation to generation or whether, as Ross said, they are balei tshuva to Yiddish.
the question of how aware people are of Yiddish influence in their English has come up already. You just mentioned that some of the frum people, whether they're Bali Tshuva or FFBs, know very specifically that something like Staying By Us is Yiddish influence and either like it or don't like it as a result. But is that general? Are the people that aware of it?
Some people are aware of it, and for some features they're more aware than others. I mentioned that experiment that I did. It was an experiment where I played speech samples for people and asked them to say if the person who said this sentence was likely to be Orthodox and if they were likely to have grown up Orthodox. And I found that coming to us is not very salient. People don't see that as a distinctively Orthodox feature. The by is very salient, but then also other things are more or less salient. And but the question of whether they associate them with Yiddish, I'm not sure. I think some people say, oh, the Yiddish by, but other people just think it's bad grammar. They don't realize that it comes from Yiddish.
But bad grammar that they associate with people who are from, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so then even if it's not Yiddish, they're aware of that it's Jewish in any case. Oh, yeah. Okay, so it's not that it comes out of completely out of left field. Does that come up at all in your work?
I don't know, because my focus, yes, there are many Yiddish words that Hasidic people use in their English, just like there are English words they use in their, but I would say that most of the Yiddish words used in English have to do with religious topics, as you would expect. But I haven't done, a thorough study on this. With respect to the other way around, English words used in Yiddish, I think for a Hasidic person, Yiddish doesn't sound Hamish if it doesn't have some English words today, So, it's a very, what I find interesting is that I don't know, what to make of this, but the issue is that at any point in its history, Yiddish has been a contact language. Okay, so it has been, and it's not unique in that position. It's just that what's maybe unique is that the number of languages with which it has been in contact. So what I know is that from the perspective of somebody, working, developing assessment, when we develop a vocabulary test, for instance, we sometimes have 5 different versions of the same concept, depending on whether these are speakers from Polish Yiddish, Hungarian Yiddish, more Northeastern Yiddish, or somebody will have borrowed an English word. So, definitely, but the issue is that, you don't sound like you speak Hasidic Yiddish unless you put some English.
Yeah, I just want to add to that that I heard a talk by Netta Abu-Gov, who's a researcher of Hasidic Yiddish, and she did a study in Antwerp and found that the same kind of thing, actually there, everyone used the Dutch word for hat, which I think was het or something like that. And, no, I don't know, I can't remember what word it was, but that was the Yiddish word for hat. And so I think it's important. This is something that some purists feel uncomfortable with. Some non-Haredi Yiddish enthusiasts are uncomfortable with Haredi Yiddish because it is so receptive to borrowing from English and other languages. But I think that just shows the vitality of the language, that it is open to borrowing.
Yeah, like I mentioned, it's not a type of borrowing in terms of quantity of pattern. So I didn't talk about this, but Poplak has done many studies on places of code switches, and the code switching in my data is typical of fluent speakers, and it's not unique to the Yiddish-speaking population. If you study the Spanish-speaking or Haitian Creole-speaking population in New York, you get the same kind of patterns. I think what's interesting is that another aspect of the language context that is interesting to look at is, for instance, I think the contact with Hebrew in the Hasidic community is probably different from the one in more secular communities. The other thing I wanted to mention is that it's not always easy to jump to the conclusion this is directly the result of the contact with English. That's what I try to show with the diminutive E. You have languages change anyway. And it's not clear that it's always a direct result of the contact with English or just a result of language change, which is also something that Zelda Kahan-Newman kind of explores. And we can't be too straight. I mean, it's hard to actually come to a straightforward conclusion sometimes.
Like the loss of gender distinctions, like day instead of
so,
d and de.
So, I mean, I think in that sense, for my own purpose, I think it's nice to digitalize written Yiddish text, but it would also be great to go back to these spoken sources like the recording on Weltreich and actually look at the changes in the spoken language, because I think we also make the mistakes of thinking that, oh, this is what the Hasidim are doing today, but actually we don't have recordings. I mean, we don't have many recordings of what was going on in terms of spoken language. So until we look at that, I think conclusions about language change versus language influence are going to be very tricky.
I have a long, long list of questions, but unfortunately, I think we're just about out of time. We'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience. So if the people who can get to the mics fastest can ask their questions. Or have the mics brought to them.
Up until the 1960s, the conceptualization in this country was of a melting pot. We then shifted to a multi-ethnic picture of ourselves. Before that time, Judaism was a religion. There were various groups, and the language continuity of Yiddish was upheld by the Sholem Aleichem schools and places like that. But certainly, beginning in the 60s and 70s, that movement died out, and there really was no setting within which Yiddish was learned until the academic departments and YIVO started language learning. By and large, secular, non-religious Jews see their Jewish identity in terms of a whole series of cultural choices that they make, whether they want to observe Passover or Hanukkah, talk about bagels and so forth. And I think Yiddish in that community is not really very important. And their children, there is no setting within which their children can learn Yiddish. It's only when children become adults and are interested in Yiddish that you have that kind of learning taking place. So what Ross was talking about is a very hit and miss kind of thing, I think, by and large, for most people. The modern Orthodox are obviously a different category. And there you have the development of a kind of newer culture because there weren't people like that 25 or 30 years ago.
I completely agree, and I didn't mean to give too optimistic a picture of the majority of secular American Jews. Obviously, what goes on in, as I said, relatively small world is not necessarily representative, but nonetheless, it's there. The National Yiddish Book Center can claim, as I understand, to be a mass membership organization with, I'm not sure, tens of thousands, maybe multiple hundreds of thousands of members, that all told. I think there is that connection, but as you say, it doesn't necessarily come with knowing more than a few words or having the most tenuous kind of connection. And there was a real snap, there was a real break in transmission. But I think it's important to realize that there's a kind of emerging field within linguistics of revivalistics, and there is a whole kind of an idea of language revival that in many ways has spread beyond what happened with Hebrew, for instance, where there were all kinds of forces that prompted the revival of Hebrew. And there's a feeling of the accessibility of the past, the fact that you can go online and if you want to hear as much Yiddish as you can handle, and that people hundreds of thousands of people will watch a YouTube video. It's not speaking at home, it's not raising a Yiddish-speaking child, but it means that there is some greater sense of access now than there was, partly because people have worked so hard to get this material up there, that was not really accessible before if you didn't live somewhere where there were Yiddish speakers. So I don't want to give too rosy a picture, but at the same time, there is this, there is a kind of a real meta-linguistic community. There is a real way in which, it is, within reach for those who get interested. But those are still a minority.
Okay, we're going to have one last question, then we're going to break for dessert. So, Lindsay?
First of all, thank you so much to the panelists and to Paul. This is really wonderful. I wanted to ask a question, and you kind of touched on it now at the end of this answer. But specifically, speaking to something that Ross said, he mentioned Rachel's, article about revival versus continuity, and I wanted to ask: is there something in Yiddish identity, for identity for that people are choosing now, that kind of creates that attachment to the idea of revival? Is it like, what do you see that as being, perhaps a part of modern Yiddish identity, I guess, by choice?
I think when people begin to probe, it can start with somebody just kind of looking at their family tree, trying to figure that out, or just sort of, having an interaction with a grandparent. I mean, the smallest little sort of wormhole you go down, and then you suddenly, and I know several people that this has happened to some extent. It happened to me. You start sort of going down one of these wormholes, and all of a sudden you confront the great sort of mass of Yiddish culture, which was sort of there, waiting all along, but you didn't necessarily know about it. I mean, most people don't know about it, but it's there. You can sort of get to it, and then that can lead in all sorts of other directions and connect you to all sorts of historical experiences in other communities. It connect you to people from Eastern Europe and Germany as well, who are non-Jews but have an interest in it. Connect you to all kinds of different communities. So I think, in a way, there is a sort of gateway there. I think there is this ability now to kind of leapfrog a little bit over generations where Yiddish transmission was snapped, because the resources are there. The question is this just going to be sort of the activity of individuals who pursue it as a sort of hobby, or will it take root in some deeper sense, I think.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there are also secularist Jews and leftist Jews and queer Jews for whom Yiddish is a way into Jewish community. And we see this, for example, in Los Angeles. There's a group called the Shalom Community, which is a secular religious school, not religious, but like a Hebrew school, but with Yiddish. And they don't learn full Yiddish, they learn post-vernacular Yiddish. So they have, instead of teachers, they have lehrers and belfers, and they learn, and their classes have the names of the Hebrew letters, but instead of Vav, it's Vav, and instead of a bar mitzvah, they have a bar mitzvah and a bas mitzvah. So for them, Yiddish is a way of being Jewish, but in a non-religious way and in a leftist way, and they are actually connected with Workman's Circle in Los Angeles, and they all have ties to Yiddishkeit Los Angeles. So organizationally, we see these. Oh, and Workman's Circle also has a connection to the queer community. So we see connections to all of these, among all of these groups, as sort of an alternative way of being Jewish outside of synagogue life.
I think we have to stop here, unfortunately. I mean, it really is unfortunate, because everything each of you has said just brings to mind that many more questions. So I think your homework assignment should be to come up with a list of questions and see to it that there are more events like this so we can spend more time talking about these things. Thank you very much to the panelists, and to the organizers, and to the audience. And yeah, now you have to go and have dessert. I'm really sorry.